Okay, so Dr. Venkateshwaralu, Professor Surinder Kumar, Professor Ramanamurthy, and all distinguished delegates to the Indian Political Economy Association's 25th Silver Jubilee Conference. I am also, like Professor Surinder Kumar, going to be discussing NEP 2020, but my point of entry is slightly different. It is the conference of the Indian Political Economy Association, so it's perfectly legitimate to look at the question of NEP 2020, the National Education Policy, from a political economy perspective, okay, which means locating it in its specific social historical context and to interpret it or understand it with reference to the social forces that lie behind the particular policy initiative. And that's what I'm going to try to do in the time that is at my disposal. Of course, it will be a rather brief and incomplete kind of discussion, because within the given time, a comprehensive presentation on this subject is, of course, difficult. To begin with, one is to, of course, locate the policy within its definite context, and that context has elements which are more immediate or short-term, and elements which are a product of a longer historical process. So generally, I am placing this, of course, within the context of Indian capitalism, which is at a particular juncture in its history of development. That's the background within which this particular policy comes. So when one is referring to Indian capitalism, one is referring to a specific capitalism which has specific characteristics or features which are the result of the peculiarities of its own development. Indian capitalism was born out of a process of subjugation of a pre-capitalist society by the world's leading capitalist power at that point of time. It's out of that post-colonial context that Indian capitalism emerges. That particular history gave its capitalist class also a particular characteristic. It was born in the shadow of colonialism, and it was emerged out of a mercantile background. So it had a very limited industrial character as compared to, say, capitalist development in Britain itself. And this particular capitalism after independence, the process of independence and the ability to use the state to promote its development in a way that wasn't possible under colonial rule, of course, opened up certain opportunities for capitalist development, but of course, in a world or a global context in which advanced capitalism still dominated. So it was a capitalist process of development in an unequal order, and it was also a capitalist process of development which had to take place under conditions where any fundamental agrarian transition had not happened and did not happen even after independence. So there was this general features of Indian capitalism whose imprint we see to this particular day. That particular capitalism's development entered a certain stage in particularly after 1991, which is what we call the neoliberal phase of development of Indian capitalism, where in greater integration with the world economy and a redefining of the role of the state in the process of Indian capitalist development became the imperative to continue that process of development. So you see the change. One and two of the important implications of the redefining of the role of the state is what we understand as fiscal conservatism, low taxes, the limited use of or the absence of the use of fiscal policy as an instrument of any kind of redistribution, and a process of privatization where different activities which may have been in the earlier strategy, the preserve of the state or the public sector, are opened up to private investment and private profiteering. These are two elements of the neoliberal phase of Indian capitalist development, which also constitute the background to the NEP. The neoliberal phase of capitalist development in further goes through different stages or phases. In this particular century, in the last decade, in the period that leads up to the global crisis, we saw the biggest boom in the history of Indian capitalism, when our GDP growth rates achieved 8 to 9%, touched 8 to 9% limits for a stretch of a period of about 5 years. and you had a massive process of increase in investment, expansion of construction activities, rapid capital formation that you saw, and expansion of India's trade with the rest of the world. Also large inflows of foreign investment. All of that happened in that particular period leading up to the global crisis. But subsequently, and particularly in the second decade, that process of accumulation has also run into a crisis, primarily because of the problem of demand that has been inherent in that process, which is based on increasing inequality, increasing appropriation of whatever is produced by a small segment of the Indian population. And the demand problems have resulted in slackening of the investment process in the second decade, slowdown in construction, a decline in the relative significance of trade. And this process has been ongoing through the second decade, and both before and after the COVID pandemic, it has only become more and more of a problem. And with that process, the accumulation process has been unable to take place through a process of expansion of production, expansion into new activities, expansion into investment in expansion of production. And there has been a shift towards that accumulation process increasingly trying to encroach on activities which had not been till then dominated by the capitalist sector or the corporate sector of the economy. So you have this process of trying to encroach because the expansion possibilities have become much more constrained. So it's a much more parasitic phase of this process of neoliberal corporate big business-led capitalist development process. And the process of neoliberal development always carried within it a tendency towards increasing authoritarianism because of the fact that the polarization that it produced, economic polarization that it produced, essentially meant that the process of hollowing out of India's democracy because of the fact that ultimately the leverage of the dominant capital classes over the state continuously increased as a result of this process, and was further used to reinforce that same process of increasing polarization. So this has meant that there was an inherent tendency towards increasing authoritarianism as the interests of different sections of Indian society just completely diverged from each other. And with the crisis, that tendency has, of course, acquired a different kind of significance. And I see what is happening in India to India's secular democracy in the last few years as a reflection of this particular process of an increasing contradiction between the interests of different segments of Indian society, where the majority interests are getting increasingly trampled in order to somehow sustain the expansion process of big corporate capital. Now, the larger picture, which is particularly relevant for Indian education, discussion of education, which has characterized India's capitalist development process throughout, has been a process of stunted industrialization. Whether you look at the period before or after neoliberalism, industrialization has never been able to play the role of driving the accumulation process of Indian capitalism on a sustained basis for long periods of time. Even now, it is more services rather than industry which play that role. Indian capitalist development has been particularly characterized by a high level of technological dependence, unable to even generate much of the technological requirements of its own expansion. And this has been combined with the reliance on cheap labor available in the Indian context because of the large labor reserves that are existing. And these processes have become only reinforced in the neoliberal era, where cheap labor has also become an important and the only decisive basis on which Indian capitalism could compete in the global economy. This competition is directly and indirectly, cheap labor has been the essential basis. Now, the neoliberal phase of development is, of course, meant a process where you first have an agrarian crisis. The agrarian crisis leads to a large exodus from agriculture, large number of people seeking work outside agriculture. The corporate process of development takes advantage of the cheap labor that this brings about in order to generate large profits and accumulate rapidly. but it does not, of course, create enough employment to be able to absorb this labor reserve. The result of this is a perpetual tendency towards keeping wages and returns to labor depressed. What you get is a process of declining work participation. Most of its effect or early effects were on women. Now we are seeing increasingly effects on men. So the large segment of the population, which does not have wealth, which does not have property, which has to essentially rely on some kind of work to generate its employment, is stuck in employment activities which earn it a very little, and that is also when they get that work, significant part of that workforce does not even get absorbed in work which gives them a return or an earning. And only a small segment of those who work, for them high salaried employment in the white collar employment has been created within this process of development of private corporate sector led development process, has only created a small pool of employment for high salaried white collar workers. And of course, in this period, the generation of such employment within the public sector itself has almost disappeared. So that only a small fragment of this total pool of people who need to work are able to access that relatively high salary kind of employment. The large majority are stuck in extremely low levels of in activities which earn them extremely low levels of work. This is the background within which Indian higher education has experienced a significant transformation, which at first sight appears to be contradictory in nature, because it seems to be going against the grain or logic of what was happening as far as the economy was concerned. Of course, consistent with the economic realities has been that public expenditure on education has remained stagnant throughout this period, including in the period of the boom. There has been not much increase in the expenditure on higher education. In fact, the expenditure by what are called the education departments themselves, and this is both central as well as state governments combined, the education department's expenditure as a proportion of GDP is actually declining. It's other expenditures by other departments which go under the head of education, which is still holding up the share of education expenditure in GDP. And within this, the part that goes towards higher education, and in particularly if you look at the part that goes towards non-technical education, is a very, very small fragment. So it's a very small portion of India's GDP which constitutes public expenditure on higher education. So within the already low level, of course, school education naturally dominates in the share, and a very small fragment is what goes towards higher education. But yet, despite this reality, what we have seen in this period of 2 decades is a massive increase in enrollment in Indian higher education, particularly during the period from the middle of the first decade to the middle of the second decade. In the last few years, there has been a clear slowing down of that growth in enrollment, and the proportion of, so the expansion of enrollment has meant that the proportion of Indians in the relevant age group studying in institutions of higher education or enrolled in institutions of higher education has gone up dramatically, which means, of course, a larger and larger segment of our younger population is now going to be of those who have been enrolled at some stage in institutions of higher education. Whether they completed or didn't complete their higher education, that's a different story. We don't have much data about what is the picture as far as that is concerned. But there's also a process of slowing down of this growth of enrollment that has happened. What has also happened during this period of rapid expansion of enrollment is that the representation of different segments of Indian society, which historically were said to be disadvantaged in terms of access to higher education, that seems to have improved. And not only improved, in most cases, with the exception of the Muslim minority in India, their share in enrollment in higher education is now quite close to their share in the population. Okay. So if you look at SC, ST, and OBC's communities, they're almost now 60% of the total enrollment in institutions of higher education. You look at females, you find they are now almost half the higher education enrollment. When I was a student, it was less than 30%. It is now almost half, and it's more than their share in the population in the relevant age group. Other minorities also, it's the same situation. In the case of the Muslim minority, it is still, there is a long distance to go. But there also it is increasing, and what is most important is that in every group that you see, the proportion of females in total enrollment is close to or above 50%. So this trend of female proportion increasing is something that you see across all social groups. So at one level, you seem to have a scenario where public investment in education has not really expanded, but there's been an increase in so-called apparently access to higher education, and there's a increasing equity in that access across where different sections which were historically disadvantaged seem to have gained the most from this expansion of enrollment. So what has actually happened is, of course, that you've had in this particular period a process of also an increased privatization of higher education. This privatization has proceeded along several different dimensions, only one of which is increase in the proportion of private institutions in higher education. But it has also taken the form of increased part of the expenditure in public university, public institutions being borne by those who are accessing education there. So privatization of that expenditure. There's privatization that has taken the form of the expansion of the tuition sector in education, and so on and so forth. There are different dimensions to this particular privatization, one of which is the increasing importance of private institutions in higher education, and an increasing part of the enrollment has been going towards private institutions. And this includes university enrollment, which is where the public institutions have historically been the most dominant. Even in university enrollment, there is a clear shift. It's a slowing down of the process of the growth of enrollment, but there's also a clear and increasing shift towards private universities. And the only part of the public segment in universities which can be said to be competing with the private universities are the open universities. So in a sense, you have increasing enrollment on the one side of the cheap form, which is cheap for public expenditure and cheap for the student, which is the open universities. And the other is the private universities. Okay. So what you've had is a process of expansion of higher education that has been based on private expansion, and therefore, of course, it means an increase in the cost of education. So how has this happened given the larger economic background within which this is taking place? It's easy to understand that private investment in education could expand if there was demand for it, that education, if people were willing to pay for that education. The question we have to answer is, why would people have been willing to pay for this education? Okay. So the private sector's expansion was possible because of an increasing demand, and the increasing demand for this, social demand for this higher education, the willingness of people across different social groups to pay more to access higher education has a perverse kind of relationship with the pattern of employment expansion that has happened. The polarization that has taken place even within the employment segment, whereby higher education appears to have acquired a position where if you don't have wealth, the only possible way of any kind of a decent economic standard, the only way to any kind of economic and social mobility is through higher education. That's the only route available. Everything else is closed. Unless you can access those particular kinds of employment, you have no chance in the game. And this is probably what has driven the process of increasing demand for education. Now, one side of that is, of course, what the private sector has done. Okay. But the state has also feel and continues to feel the political need to respond to this increasing social demand for higher education. Okay. The need to expand access to higher education in response to this increasing demand is a pressure that the state feels. But the deepening fiscal crisis as a result of fiscal conservatism being savagely applied in a time of deepening crisis of the accumulation process itself, that deepening and fiscal crisis is combined with a situation where the expansion of private higher education is also facing effective demand limits. That is, if you have this kind of economic polarization taking place, then as you keep going down the ladder, up to a point, people may still be willing to pay more and access their higher education. Beyond a point in the economic ladder, it becomes impossible. And therefore, even private higher education is facing limits to its expansion because of the fact that the market that was available, in a sense, has been fully exhausted. And simply there isn't a way of finding new opportunity for expansion. The third element is, how to resolve this problem of responding to this increasing demand for higher education which is faced by the state, when you neither have the fiscal means to do so, nor can you rely on private investment to be able to solve that particular problem. If you do manage to expand, even then there is a problem, which is that you already have a problem that the enrollment that has taken place in Indian higher education is of an order that is far greater than any kind of employment opportunities that the same process of development has created. And there is this growing gap between the two, which would only grow if this higher education expands. But the employment situation is basically being determined by the deepening crisis of the neoliberal process of development. This is a potentially explosive situation, which the state would also be, of course, concerned about. When this is going to explode, there are signs that this has been the source of deepening student unrest. But when this particular process would lead to an even bigger explosion, that's a potential threat that is growing within the womb of this particular process of development. And I see the NEP 2020 as a response to all these different imperatives created by this particular context, where the NEP 2020 essentially seeks to create a higher education marketplace which will allow private expansion of higher education, allow simultaneously in apparently increased access to higher education, but eliminate the system and the education process capacity, emaciate it of any progressive content which would allow that process to pose a danger to the continuation of this crisis-ridden neoliberal path of development. Okay. So the market, that higher education marketplace that is being sought to be created, is something like this, where higher education institutions would be run like business firms, not only be business firms, but would run like business firms, offering a range of education products. That is, you have a policy which allows a range of products, different prices, high-end, low-end, part contribution to an education to full degrees, different kinds of a whole range of products, a policy which facilitates a whole range of products being offered by different higher education institutions, which can cater to different segments of the market, given that the ability to pay is varied across different sections of that particular market. Okay, so if you allow this greater degree of product differentiation, even the private sector can access a larger market than if it is reliant on providing, say, 3-year, 4-year degrees and relying on people who can pay for that entire 4-year period or 3-year period and pay it at one go. And this, of course, makes teachers into employees and students as consumers. And the regulatory mechanism that is being sought to be put into place is a bit like the role of rating agencies and regulation agencies play in other markets, let's say the telecom market or the share market. And this would be a mechanism by which the state would be able to still control what happens in higher education institutions without, however, a concomitant commitment to provide the public funding. So it can pose conditions that institutions have to meet. But unlike the present process, when the UGC, if it makes a regulation, it is also simultaneously asked, please provide the resources to enable us to do what is required to meet that regulation. That connection is being divorced, and without public funding, control of the state over the higher education system is being established through the regulatory system being created. And within institutions, you would, of course, have a erosion of any kind of democratic self-governance. But institutions become the centers in which all bargaining has to happen, because everything, pay, fees, etc., service conditions would be set at the level of the institution. That's where the bargaining process has to happen. But of course, there the boards of governors will be the bosses ruling, So you break up the bargaining process and you eliminate any kind of a bargaining process that is at a larger or a national plane or even at the level of a state, and therefore weaken the countervailing forces. So you can't have, say, IFACTO and FedCuta, say, bargaining with the UGC about what pay and service conditions of teachers across the country should be like. Everyone has to bargain with their own institutions, because now each of these institutions would be an autonomous element. So why do I say, when I'm saying this question of the marketplace, you look at the text of the new education policy, the national education policy itself, and you can see the elements which go into making of this. So it has a certain vision of the economic future. Okay. And this particular vision is one in which clearly the same trend that we are seeing in the employment market, which is a small segment of workers, employees being able to access high salary jobs, that same process of development is only going to be reinforced. That's what it visualizes, explicitly visualizes. Okay, where unskilled jobs being done today would be basically eliminated. So that's one of the imperatives that the policy says it is responding to. And when it responds to that, it derives inspiration from the ancient world. Okay, it derives its inspiration from the ancient world. That's why we will find the answer to how you meet the challenges of this new emerging reality. So in this new emerging reality, of course, the only problem that they have to solve is how does the system create? Okay, how does the system create enough of a pool of people who can meet these jobs? Now that job requirement is for a limited number of people. Okay, so how do you meet that requirement? That's one priority that is to be met by this whole idea of developing so-called holistic education or liberal art education, which involves several different disciplines. Okay, that's the way in which you resolve the requirement of meeting the development trajectories requirement of a particular kind of skilled workforce. This is a very narrow objective, frankly speaking, because the requirements of the development of knowledge in general, the requirements of different segments of the requirements of India's development process, which would enable everyone to participate in it. There are several other such requirements which do not seem to have any kind of a priority. The whole focus is firstly on creating this limited workforce which will meet the private corporate capital's development process requirements. Okay, and because of course it's a capitalist development which relies on technology from outside, it only wants people to run that technologies. It doesn't want people who will create technologies. It certainly doesn't want people who will create technologies for all the poor, hardworking Indians who are not really in a position to pay very heavily for any products that they would buy. So it's a very narrow requirement that emanates from the specific character of Indian capitalism, which then drives this particular policy making. But there's a recognition that this will, of course, the people who would find access to those kinds of jobs would be extremely limited in number. And you have this paradoxical combination. So on the one hand, you say that most of the jobs of that kind will disappear in the future, but yet you say vocational education has to be now integrated into the higher education system. The only meaning that one can derive from this is that what is being put in place is an education system which on the one hand will create this small segment which will access those high salaried jobs. The rest are to be pushed into this vast labor market and left to fend for themselves. The only thing that the system will do will try and teach them some skills which might help them to somehow find some way of surviving in the world. And the increasing access in higher education, so much stress is put on distance learning, the use of digital technologies, etc., to increase access and increase the gross enrollment ratio. Okay. Now, this is something that offers to the state a low-cost option of increasing access. So if you want to increase access to education, if you want to tell people you have access to education, but don't want to spend too much on it, distance learning online education. And of course, there is also so-called blending of this that is happening. So from the public investment point of view, it is cheap. Okay, the consumer student can also, in appearance, it may be a cheap way of accessing it. You don't have to pay high fees and study in an institution. You can do it online. Okay. Of course, there are mixtures of this, and it also offers private institutions, the private higher education providers, means of entering into the market for even low-end education in a way that may have been limited in the past. Okay. And the same thing applies with this whole thing of multiple exit options, that you can exit after 1 year, exit after 2 years, exit after 3 years. You can bank what you have done in the academic bank for credit and combine it with what you do later in order to get a higher degree. So these are ways in which the education process is to be broken up. And you don't therefore need to have the means to do a full complete degree program. You can do fragments of these at different points of time, in different locations, in different modes, and you can all combine all of them in order to get a degree. So what is being then put into place is that a system where some people who have the means can access a coherent, full-fledged degree program because they have the means to do it and do it in one go in a definite sequence. While others for others, an illusion is created that you can do the same. If you don't have the means to do it at one go, you can do it in these parts and fragments. And if you don't have the means to do it in a regular institution, you can do it online, and somehow you can combine and you will be in the same position as the rest. Ultimately, when they go to the employment market, clearly the two categories of students will be placed very differently. And of course, how does this matter? If large number of people are brought into the system but remain uneducated, their learning remains extremely limited, it does not matter, because really you're only responding to a social political imperative to expand the so-called access, but you're not really interested in educating people who then may start asking questions about where are my jobs? And while there is this talk about investment in public education in the letter of the policy, as Professor Surendra Kumar mentioned, this has been there for a long time. But while recognizing this objective has been there for a long time, has remained unfulfilled, the policy has no concrete proposal about how an objective that has remained unfulfilled for decades will now be fulfilled. But there are several parts which are creating the opportunities for an expanding private sector in higher education. You may call it philanthropic private community participation, but that's the name under which all the privatization of Indian higher education has happened. It remains, even today, Indian higher education is a not-for-profit sector. And within that not-for-profit sector, of course, legal framework, all the privatization has actually happened. So there is this whole set of proposals which was about facilitating expansion in private higher education, also its internationalization, where those who have the means can access supposedly higher quality education offered by foreign service providers, and to Indian higher education systems can cater to the low end of the international market, make some money out of that also, catering to students who may come from the more underdeveloped parts of the world, but have some means to pay for the education which Indian higher education services can provide. And in clearly the mechanism, yeah, I'm closing now. In the mechanism for governing institutions, you have this clear structure where autonomy of institutions, and autonomy means basically you can set fees as you want, you can set the service conditions of employees as you want, of teachers and non-teaching staff as you want, and the decision-making process at the level of institution will be controlled by a board of governors, not by the faculty that is employed. The faculty status now would be they are accountable to the board of governors. Okay, so how much of a bargaining they are in a position to do, even about their pay and service conditions, will becomes clear. And the regulatory structure that is being put in place this division of the regulatory system into its different components, behind which, of course, remains the state, okay, is the way in which you break up the different parts and make the regulatory process independent of a commitment to public investment. Control without the responsibility for investment, that's the structure that the regulatory framework proposed by the education policy will be. And so you can see in all these elements of the policy how a kind of particular education marketplace which responds to the different and competing imperatives created by the present situation of Indian capitalism, how it responds to that particular thing, where private interests can flourish and private capitals, you expand the scope for private investment, limit the scope for public investment, maintain state control over the thing, and yet create the illusion of expanding access and enrollment in higher education. With that, let me conclude. Thank you.
Thank you, Surjit. Extremely insightful, extremely critical evaluation of NEP which I've ever heard so far. I thank you profusely. I think I'm sure this should provoke us to take this debate forward and discuss this at different fora, at different levels of universities and colleges. And I don't know, I mean, I'm sure there must be some ways in which this process has to be widely debated, and a public debate, public opinion has to be generated. Thank you once again. Now I invite